This is a media diary of the Geologists Association Moroccan field trip in November 2024, journeying from Marrakech via the high Atlas Mountains to the exceptionally fossil-rich rocks in the southeast of the country. Leaving Marrakech, you cross the flat, fertile Haouz plain, beyond which the foothills of the high Atlas rise sharply. The plain is underlain by a sedimentary basin, the foreland basin to the mountain front. The sediments outcropping in the basin are young tertiary deposits. The foothills are dominated by red beds of Triassic and Jurassic age. These were deposited in rift basins opened by the extensional forces on the crust as the supercontinent Pangaea broke apart. Later, from around 65 million years ago, northward movement of the African plate against the European plate resulted in the forces on the Moroccan crust switching from extensional to compressive, producing inversion of the rift basins, changing basins to areas of elevated topography. The high Atlas area was born. As you pass through the foothills, many of the high ridges are the rims of spectacular synclinal folds formed during the time of crustal compression. These structures are revealed when viewed in Google Earth. Superimposing the geology map onto the images reveals the rims to be outcrops of Jurassic rocks surrounded by Triassic red beds. Continuing on the steepening climb towards the Tichka Pass, we leave the Triassic red beds and move onto the rocks that underlie the Triassic rocks. These are mainly thin sandstones and slates, deformed and metamorphosed, lower Paleozoic rocks of Cambrian and Ordovician age. View northwards of the journey we have made from the young rocks of the Haouz Basin through the Triassic and Jurassic foothills to the lower Paleozoic rocks of the Central Mountains. Looking westward, the core of the High Atlas is formed of Precambrian metamorphic, granitic and volcanic rocks underlying the Paleozoic rocks. Notice how the Triassic and Jurassic rocks wrap round the older rocks of the core of the mountains. Effectively, the High Atlas is a large anticlinal structure in which erosion has exposed the older core rocks as inliers. After crossing the highest point at an altitude of 2,260 meters, the descending route passes from lower Paleozoic rocks back onto Triassic and Jurassic rocks. Passing through the valley between the High Atlas and Anti-Atlas ranges, the steep escarpment on either side of the road is formed of Jurassic red beds, with basalts and associated paleosols, red soils formed on the tops of the weathered basalts before burial by sediments or new lava flows. At the highest levels of the escarpments, Cretaceous limestones outcrop. Leaving the valley, the terrain opens out as you enter the Paleogene-Neogene Ouarzazate Basin. The basin extends east to west along the line of the Agadir Fault System, which extends to Agadir on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Agadir was obliterated by the earthquake of 1960. As you enter the western side of Ouarzazate, you pass two large film studios. A break for lunch was made at the gardens of Ouarzazate Hotel. Leaving Ouarzazate, the route passes over Precambrian volcanics, tuffs and intrusives. Exploring the 571-million-year-old stromatolites that developed on the edge of ponds fed by alkaline waters from underground sources, stromatolite mounds form from the adhesion of sediment to the extrusions by colonies of blue-green and other algae. Over time, this leads to the formation of layered structures. The stromatolites here are preserved in almost life position, as can be seen by overlaying an image of present-day stromatolites from Western Australia. Crossing the Draa River Valley just outside Agdaz, Jebel Kis Ane, a synclinal structure of Cambrian sandstone, 14 kilometers long and 1.8 kilometers wide. After just over 400 kilometers from Marrakech, arriving at Hotel Meteorites,
Sediment being derived from the African continent, and on the more distal parts of this shelf they are finer grained sediments, and they would slump. And I think that this layer here is a very, very large slump where sediment has just suddenly gone moving downhill, maybe triggered by an earthquake. And what happens is that all of the trilobites that were ever so happy doing trilobite things on that surface got caught up in this sediment slide and simply moved down, and they got buried in it. And when you see the fossils that are nicely prepared, when we go to see the preparation or we go to see the shops, you will see some of them are rolled up, some of them got their backs arched. They're in all sorts of orientations other than having sort of sitting around on the ground crawling and had the sediment come over them. That's what you call an abruption deposit. So there's the seafloor doing what seafloor does. A pile of sediment comes in and buries everything, and that's all on one layer. Yeah, that's all on one layer.
What's the host sediment?
But here, the host sediment is a mud. It's a rather greenish looking mud. It's carbonate cemented in places, and this has trilobites scattered throughout, all in different orientations. So they came with the sediment and got incorporated in. So they're technically what we would call allochthonous. Have you ever heard these terms? Autochthonous and allochthonous. It's applied in all sorts of ways. It's a great way of sounding like you're bloody clever. Yeah? But autochthonous means it's in place, and allochthonous means it's out of place. So these trilobites probably didn't live here. They probably lived 10 kilometres upslope. By the way, the slope is so imperceptible it didn't look like a slope. Like some of the ground around here, it looks flat. It's not quite. They're all big alluvial fans and terraces. And so these things came in with a big sediment slide and were in all sorts of orientations, and then they died.
the fossilized cone-shaped shells of Devonian nautiloid cephalopods, ancestors of today's octopus, squid, and cuttlefish. Tentacles and a beak-like mouth protruded from the open end of the shell. Size varied from a few centimeters in length to several meters based on a few rare finds. Movement by a kind of jet propulsion, in which seawater was forced through a fleshy tube that ran along the underside of the shell. Position in the water column controlled by adjusting the amount of seawater in the chambers of the shell. In the early Devonian, submarine basaltic eruptions create a paleo-high on the seafloor. The high becomes densely colonized by crinoids, leading to the formation of crinoidal packstones. Reactivation of the magmatic source domes the paleo-high, while ascending hydrothermal fluids form carbonate mounds at vent sites. Aerobic bacterial oxidation of methane is considered the main process driving carbonate precipitation and rapid lithification of the mounds. The now exhumed mounds allows you to walk on what is effectively the Devonian seafloor upon which the mounds formed some 400 million years ago. The Kem group, named after the Kem area of southeast Morocco, is made up of fluvial deposits, rivers, deltas and lakes, formed during the Cretaceous Albian to Cenomanian ages. The beds are rich in vertebrate fossils, including freshwater fish and large terrestrial pteropods, such as the huge dinosaur Spinosaurus, which was larger and heavier than Tyrannosaurus rex. The beds of the Kem group were forming at the time that Africa was separating from South America, and the fossils of the Moroccan Kem are very similar to many fossils occurring in Brazil in rocks of the same age.
Worked in the mines over here, and it still worked. You can see big grooves behind you. You can see where minerals have been extracted there. There's a new mine that's been set up over there. Sometimes it's bigger companies, sometimes it's one man and a dog, and as you drive along this road you can eventually get to Rasani and you'll see mines all the way along. So that's Ordovician. Notice the dip of the strata. They're dipping over in an easterly direction, and you can see behind the ridge that we're standing on another ridge with that rather nice serrated edge that we've seen elsewhere. And those rocks over there are Devonian. So if that's Ordovician and that's Devonian, we ought to have a little bit of Silurian in between. And we have here, and we've got a limestone, but if you look carefully at this limestone, it's actually rather special. It's a crinoidal limestone, and it has crinoids all the way along. It is just made up of crinoids. At its lower surface, you will find lots and lots of long crinoid stems, but elsewhere in it, you will find some rather strange globular-looking structures. And if they're broken inside, you will see big coarse calcite crystals. They are filling some chambers in this globular structure. And if you find one which isn't too heavily weathered and you get your hand lens out, you'll find that this globular structure is made up of lots of little plates. And if you're really lucky, you'll find one that on one side has what looks like the holdfast of a crinoid and a broken off stem. So it'll look like there's a little sort of flower on the top of it. These things have the name lobolith.
time fish there. Nature is the best artist. Nature is the best artist.
The crinoids were all growing on the seafloor. Around them are their dead relatives, their dead ancestors. And then in comes the sediment that knocks them all over and buries the whole lot. So the ones that you're looking at are the ones that were alive when the event happened. And all of the debris is the ones that were dying over how long a period I don't know, but it's not a massively thick bed, so it probably isn't very many years that the event happened after the crinoid meadow developed in the first place. Yeah. So whatever explanation you do, right, it has to explain everything you see in the layer. Yeah. But it is without a doubt what we would call an event horizon. Yeah, an event horizon.
This escarpment of Devonian rocks is the same feature as that carrying the mud mounds visited on day 4, but approached from the opposite side and further east along the ridge. The Ziz River flows for 282 kilometers from its source in the High Atlas Mountains southward into the Sahara Desert in Algeria. It provides irrigation for palm groves and other crops along its valley. The river has cut the Ziz Canyon into late Cretaceous sandstones and limestones.
Hey! Hey! How are you? Are you good? Yeah. The whole of the limestone sequence that sits on top of the Kem is called the Akraboo Formation. We've got a little bit younger Akraboo, and we're now in the Turonian part of it, not the Cenomanian part of it, the Turonian. So the bottom of the Turonian is what, about 90 million years or something like that? It's at a time when the world's sea levels were probably at their highest. Yeah, it was probably the peak of the marine transgression that did for the Wealden, that finished that, flooded all of the continents, and enormous parts of the planet were covered with water. Enormous parts. There were, during the earlier parts of the Cretaceous, a couple of times when the oxygen levels in the oceans actually went down. They're called ocean anoxic events, AOEs. Yeah. And this is one of them here. But what you can see above us is that the limestones are massive, and you can see that they've got quite a rough texture. A lot of those are shelly limestones packed full of oysters and things like that. And if we were on the cliff over there, where you can see these beds are rising, quite a lot of the limestones below these limestones that we're standing on are also really shelly. They're shallow water limestones. But this event here represents the peak of the transgression, and these are deeper water facies. And what you can see is that they are very finely bedded. In fact, they're laminated, which hints at some anoxia, because there's nothing burrowing the sediment. So there's not a lot of oxygen, so it's not full of bivalves. There are some horizons where there are lots of bivalves, but they're all small, shallow burrowers, and there's none of the normal sort of pholadomyids and things, the nice deep burrowing things, and all of the stuff that churns sediment up. So there's been a halt in this biotubation, and that's often thought to be caused by having anoxia or dysoxia, which stops there being a diverse benthos. Yeah? The cool thing about this particular locality is that every time an ammonite died, every time a fish died, every time a turtle died, or a pliosaur or plesiosaur but not an ichthyosaur, and sod it, not a pterosaur either, a nodule formed around the animal before it could fall apart, or before anything might scavenge it. Well, it might not get scavenged if there's no oxygen, nothing down there to do that. So the fossils in here are three-dimensional because the concretion formed early on. We sometimes, if we want to sound clever, call them eodiagenetic concretions, early diagenetic concretions. The formation of them occurs before any compaction. Yeah? It is possible that when this was happening, if there had been some winnowing, you'd have ended up with a seafloor of spherical or subspherical concretions lying on the seafloor. But they're actually scattered throughout. But where Mohammed is standing, there is a layer there where the concretions very often contain a three-dimensional fossil, a fish or an ammonite, and occasionally a plesiosaur, a pliosaur or a tethyosaur, and even turtles as well. Some very big turtles, not small, big turtles, yeah? And so this is the pay dirt horizon. I call this, in my publications, the Asfla member, naming it after this village. So this articulated fish, or plesiosaur, starts to decompose, and that triggers bacterial processes, hundreds of different bacterial processes because there's lots of different bacteria. But one of them is that there are bacteria, you may have heard of this name, they're called methanogens. And some of them are called sulfate reducers. Both of these bacteria need anoxic conditions. Oxygen would be a poison to them, but they still respire. It's just that electron exchange is through a bunch of other chemicals rather than oxygen, yeah? So one of the things that they trigger is the precipitation of calcium carbonate. So as soon as these organisms, these animals that have fallen into the bottom start to decompose, these bacteria thinking, bloody hell, this is all right, isn't it? I was surviving on the tiniest bit of nutrient, and now, bloody hell, the Last Supper has arrived. And they go bananas. And they trigger the precipitation of a concretion. But early on, the sediment is barely compacting. And so the fish is articulated and in 3D. And that means really exceptional preservation. So exceptional that some of the soft tissues, when the decomposition begins, they actually get phosphatized. Now the cool thing about phosphate is that phosphate minerals don't break down in organic acids like formic and acetic. They will in hydrochloric, but not in acetic. Pop one of these fish in acetic acid, you'll dissolve the concretion away, you'll still have its bones, and if you look in its tummy, you will find what it had for dinner, lots of little fishes very often, and if you look in its head, you will find the gills. And I don't mean like the gill skeleton, I mean the gills, the soft tissues with the secondary lamellae, yeah? It has that sort of soft tissue formation, and sometimes you'll find the musculature that operates the tail.
Ait Ben Haddou is an outstanding example of a fortified village, or sar, built in Moroccan clay and straw-style architecture. Located along the former caravan route between Marrakech and the Sahara, it has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1987